came out tonight on this this beautiful evening for our September BCRC meeting. We just have one quick item of business, which is the approval of the minutes from the July 27th meeting in Prospect. A copy of the minutes here is also in your packet. Are there any questions on the minutes? If not, I'd look for a motion to approve in a second.
Motion to
Sheila?
approve.
Is there a second? Dana, thank you.
Absolutely.
Get the name?
Tell that.
Any questions, comments, edits? Great. All those in favor of approval of the minutes?
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Thank you. So tonight, even with the small crowd, we have two kind of exciting discussions, both of which are statewide projects in which BCRC is participating with the other of 10 regional planning commissions around the state through our organization known as VAPTA, or the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies. So this first project is in conjunction with the Vermont Public Service Department, who is contemplating an update to the state's renewable energy standards. And all of the RPCs around the state have been tasked with holding one or two regional listening sessions. This is the first of our two. The second one will be next week in Wilmington, which we're doing in conjunction with the Wyndham Regional Commission to receive input on possible updates to the state's renewable energy standards. And our BCRC planners, Callie Fishburne and Samantha Page, have been working in conjunction with the Public Service Department on what will be a brief presentation and a series of questions and interactive exercises to receive input from this group, and then we'll be going through a similar process next Wednesday up in Wilmington. Just heads up that GNAT-TV, as you can see, is here filming, so did want to give just a heads up so folks are aware of that as we enter the process. So, Sam, Callie, floor is yours. Thanks.
Just so that no one's surprised later, when we get to the more interactive discussion part of this, the first question we're going to be asking you to get up and move and go out and look at some of those sheets of paper around the wall there. We'll explain more, but I just want to set that expectation now so that everyone's mentally prepared. So thanks everyone for coming. Again, as Bill said, I'm Callie Fishburne, and
Hi, I'm Samantha Page.
And so we are here tonight to do a listening session where we are primarily listening to you about electricity, the state of Vermont's electricity. So as Bill said, we are doing this in collaboration with the Vermont Department of Public Service, who has, they've been undertaking this very comprehensive review of the renewable energy standard and renewable electricity policies and programs around the state. This comes from a directive in the state's Vermont Comprehensive Energy Plan that the Public Service Department do this review. So they actually started the process at the end of last year. They did an educational webinar series through this past winter. They've convened a technical advisory stakeholder group to review some of the more technical aspects of these policies and programs. And they're doing a variety of different public engagement sessions in partnership with regional planning commissions. You're at one of them right now, as well as a number of other, engagement opportunities as well. And so all of this, the Public Service Department will be collecting this feedback. We'll be reporting our high-level takeaways from our listening sessions to them, and they will actually be collecting this and using it to inform their report and recommendations to the Vermont legislature, hopefully in time for the 2024 legislative session. So that's the context of why we're here today. So as part of this effort, the Public Service Department is interested in who is attending these sessions and who they're reaching in their outreach. So they do have a demographic survey that they are requesting that folks who participate take. If you want to get fancy and scan the QR code now, you are welcome to do so, but we also have paper copies of the demographic survey out on one of those tables that's sort of behind the door out there. Again, this is voluntary, the responses are anonymous. It just helps us and the Public Service Department understand who they're reaching through these efforts. So now Sam is going to present some information to you all, and I'll just say you don't have to remember all of this and feel like you're an expert at the end of it. This is just some context setting.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that the purpose of the brief overview we're going to do is to give everyone a little bit of a foundation on what the state's current energy policies and programs are, so that we can spend most of our time having more of a discussion about what you all think the priorities and preferences and sort of direction of those energy policies should be going forward. So we're gonna move through this pretty quickly and we can answer questions about it, but it's just a quick foundation. So the state of Vermont in the last 20 years has developed a number of policies and programs to advance the use of renewable energy in the state, and one of the main policies is the Renewable Energy Standard, which sets the requirements for increasing the use of renewable electricity by utilities in the state. So there's a very technical definition that Vermont uses for renewable energy, which is energy produced using a technology that relies on a resource that is being consumed at a harvest rate at or below its natural regeneration rate. And for the purposes of today and this conversation, the main takeaway is that in Vermont, renewable includes resources like solar, hydro, wind, and biomass, and it doesn't include nuclear, although it does consider nuclear a no-carbon energy source. And to dive a little bit more into how the Renewable Energy Standard is implemented, it has 2 tiers that we'll talk about. So the tiers are ways of sort of measuring how the utilities are acquiring their renewable electricity. So tier 1 requires that any resource provided, any resource that the utilities are acquiring is provided to the New England region. This can include imports from outside New England, such as New York or Quebec, and the metric was set at 55% of the electricity that the utilities were acquiring in 2017, and it's increasing incrementally, and the goal is to achieve 75% by 2032. And just to note right now that the utilities are exceeding this requirement at the moment. But we'll talk a little bit more about how renewable the grid is, or our mix is, in a minute. Tier 2 adds a little bit of nuance, and so there's this other piece of the requirement that asks utilities to acquire a certain percentage of their electricity from smaller resources that are located in Vermont and were built after June 30th in 2015. And this requirement is often met with programs like the net metering program, which maybe some of you are familiar with. And if not, we'll describe it now. So net metering is a way for Vermonters in their homes, businesses, or communities to generate electricity from smaller scale resources. So here we're seeing an example that's a solar panel on a home, and this solar panel generates electricity that powers the home, and any excess energy that's produced is then measured and can be contributed to the electric grid in Vermont, and then the homeowner is compensated accordingly. So that depends on how much excess energy they're generating, how large the system is, where it's sited. So Vermont has established some preferred sites, and that is taken into account. And then the use of a renewable energy credit or a renewable energy certificate, which I'll describe more in a minute too. So Through the net metering program, smaller scale participants are able to contribute to the grid and be compensated accordingly. And then just to sort of quickly define this renewable energy certificate or renewable energy credit, they're used interchangeably and they're also called RECs for short. This system is an accounting system that the state uses to keep track of how renewable electricity is in the state. So for every 1 megawatt hour of renewable electricity that's generated either out of state and brought in or generated in state, there's a REC associated with it, and they can be bundled together and they can also be separated, and it becomes a bit of a rabbit hole if you try to follow it all the way down, but for the purposes of today's conversation, the important thing to know is that RECs are how the state keeps track of how renewable our electricity is. They were created in part to create a market that would support and sustain renewable energy generation in the state, and it's also meant to make sure that nobody's double counting renewable energy that they're creating. And so to now think a little bit more about how renewable our energy actually is, Callie's gonna walk us through some pie charts.
Yeah, I'm just going to pause for a quick sec to distribute some of these handouts. Thank you. I think we should have plenty of copies. So one of each to, so I'll just sec for that. Okay, so give everyone a minute to shuffle their papers through. Okay. Thank you, Bill. So, as you can see on this pie chart here, which you also have in one of the handouts in front of you, this essentially represents the sources of the electricity that we use in Vermont. As you can see, it's largely renewable based on the definition that Sam talked about 72% renewable and 90% carbon-free if you factor in nuclear. About 10% comes from a mix from the New England grid, and that is largely sourced from fossil fuels. So, So this gives you a snapshot of generation within Vermont. This is also a handout that you have in front of you. Important to note that all of this in-state generation that you see here represents only about 1/3 of Vermont's electricity needs. So we're only generating in-state enough electricity to meet about 1/3 of our needs currently.
Is there not enough wind to make it on the pie chart?
Most likely, yeah. If you were to go back, yeah. Wind is included in other renewables. It's such a small percentage that it's just included in that 1% of other renewables. Yeah. And so looking at this in-state generation, you can see on the graph on your left that there's a little bit of trying to see those colors there. There's not a whole lot of generation in the Bennington County region. Size of circle represents a larger installed megawatt capacity. So the graph on the right hand side, or the graphic on the right hand side, shows solar capacity by town in the state. So the Bennington County region down in the southwest corner, you can see that Pownell and Bennington have the most solar capacity installed, or solar generation capacity installed at this time. But that overall the Bennington County region doesn't have that much solar capacity installed at this time compared to some of the other parts of the state, like specifically the Chittenden County and northwest parts of the state. So again, this is only meeting about a third of our needs right now. So different sources of electricity have different trade-offs. This is also a handout you have in front of you. You have this chart in front of you. So, there's a lot of factors to consider when, looking at where our electricity comes from. Some, sources of electricity have, the benefit of being, carbon-free or more environmentally friendly or causing less pollution, but they might be more expensive. That sort of thing. So next slide. So again, this is a follow-up that different sources of electricity have different trade-offs. This graph here on the left-hand side, which is titled Natural Resource Impacts, really actually is just reflecting the amount of land intensity. It isn't really comprehensively natural resource impacts. You can see that wind energy is pretty land intensive. Mostly because there's a significant buffer that needs to be around wind turbines. You don't want to put houses right next to a wind turbine. So that's why it requires so much land. By comparison, fossil fuels are significantly less land intensive, but they've got the other potentially drawbacks of causing more pollution, potentially causing health impacts and that sort of thing. And then there's also cost. I know cost is a huge factor for people in determining where they get their energy, if they even have that choice. And just some other trade-offs, other factors to consider when we're looking at where we get our energy. So from an economic development perspective, there are actually it's a not insignificant number of jobs within the state coming from renewable resource industry. And then there's also equity considerations as well that I also want to mention. Efficiency Vermont actually just released the newest version of their energy burden report just a couple weeks ago, so it's very recent. It looks at a number of different things. Here, this graph shows electricity burden, but they also look at transportation burden and energy burden as a whole. And energy burden can be, measured by the percentage of your income that you spend on energy costs. So if you spend a higher percent of your income on energy costs, you're more energy burdened. So I would encourage everyone to look at that report if you're curious about more about energy burden. So I'll pause and see if anyone has any questions before we move into more of the discussion part.
I did a one. Can you go back one slide? So the idea that the 1,990 jobs of solar generation are producing 3% of our renewable electricity-based RECs, and that 130 hydro jobs are producing 17% of our state's RECs. It seems like kind of.
I don't think that's what it means. I think this is just.
I'm sort of connecting those two separate.
Gotcha. I think this is just number of jobs, not connected to that.
Yeah.
I forget what report. It's like from the. Oh, there we go. 2022 Vermont Clean Energy Industry Report is where this comes from. So you'd have to look into it to find a little bit more information, but I don't think it's connected to the recs, to the credits.
I was saying the jobs per megawatt, and saying there's like a land per megawatt.
No.
Well,
No.
I guess I would say it's possible that these jobs reflect installations that aren't online yet, and so if there is construction of solar arrays that are being supported by these jobs in 2022, but that power isn't reflected in the data on the recs, which I think might have been from 2021. There's a little bit of a lag.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we get into the first question we have for you all? This is the
I
moving
just want
question.
to make a comment about the amount of land taken up with wind generation. Especially when you're developing wind in an environment like Vermont, a large part of that land consumption is with the infrastructure that supports it, namely the roads and the access to get those large pieces of equipment up there. So it's, a lot of people think windmill, the footprint isn't that big, but it's the network of the road and
Yeah.
also the transmission
Yeah.
of the power to the grid from
Yeah.
the source.
Yeah, and this factors in not just like the physical footprint of a turbine, but like the buffer that you need to give for residences, again, because for various reasons, you don't want to put homes or schools or anything literally next door to a wind turbine.
You should go down to Hull and visit Hull, where their wind turbine is located right next to the high school
Interesting.
and
Yeah.
a neighborhood, and you
Yeah.
can sit under it and
Yeah,
read a book.
interesting,
Um,
yeah,
And the other wind turbine in Hull is on their old landfill.
yeah. Well, I think at least from a Vermont context, Vermont has like
Not yet.
sites and standards for, buffers, and I think the Vermont, our BCRC's regional energy plan actually establishes, I think it's a 1 kilometer residential buffer around wind turbines, so,
Greater than, I think, a megawatt.
greater than a megawatt, okay, yeah, thank you. So, any other questions before we go into our first, discussion question? Okay, so I'm gonna move to that. So, we've got 4 questions, and, depending on the flow, we'll hopefully get to all of them, but if we don't, it's not a big deal. And so we'll basically just, we have these questions for you. You don't need to be an expert on everything we just presented to you in order to answer these. They're sort of structured to kind of be accessible, we hope, for you all. So this first question we're going to ask, what do you think should be prioritized when thinking about where Vermont gets its electricity? And then we've actually got these sticky papers up in the other room. There's a few of them, and there's some priorities for your consideration, like affordability, reliability, and we've got some lovely sticky dots over there on the table. Oh, no, you've got the sticky dots. Okay, Sam's got the sticky dots. They're different colors. It doesn't matter what color. The color doesn't signify anything in this instance. You don't have to just pick one. You can put as many, 1 dot per priority, please, but you don't have to just pick one priority. And the sheets are divided in half with 2 different priorities on each. It's not an either or, pick one or the other. I was just trying to save paper. So, so I'll just give you a couple minutes to go put your dots on what you think the priority should be. And BCRC staff are encouraged to participate. Thank you for engaging in that quintessential planning exercise. This is actually my first dot voting exercise, so I'm a real planner now. I was not before. So, just taking a look at, it's interesting, a lot of dots. Really, there's only one I thought was interesting. There's only 1 dot on location of the resource, i.e. whether it's coming from an in-state versus out-of-state. So, interesting, I guess there didn't seem to be much of a preference for where we get it, but affordability, a few dots, number of dots on reliability, got a handful of dots over here on supporting local jobs, impacts on natural resources.
Yeah, I think it seems like almost everyone everyone did put a dot on reliability and supporting local jobs. Almost everyone put dots for how renewable the energy is, whether it's reducing emissions. And then there's a comment here that also kind of broadens the scope to think about like the whole life cycle of emissions in the electricity. So not just maybe whether it's a wind turbine generating electricity, but whether the materials used and how those materials come to where they're located are low emission or no emission. In terms of the reliability, which is really important. It comes up again here as another priority in terms of making sure the grid is more robust in rural areas. And I think this kind of relates back to some of the last slides that Callie talked through in terms of the trade-offs. If like half or more of the things we've all established are high priority, that there might be times when we have to still choose some of those over others, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about the challenges of navigating that too. Does anyone have any other observations or thoughts?
I didn't even think about this until now, but trends in electricity consumption, like is there a role, a public policy role to play in helping to reduce that or continuing that trend, which I think it's kind of going down per year.
Well,
reducing.
sorry, I'm trying to write, and this is really bad. I'm talking.
No, you're all right.
Okay, thank you. So, we actually, every year Efficiency Vermont sends each RPC a report on electricity usage for each of their towns in their region, as well as some additional data about like number of projects that were done through Efficiency Vermont programs and that sort of thing, as well as number of EVs registered. And so they get that data from GMP. And for the past years, it's actually shown our electricity, like kilowatt usage going up. But to some degree that's to be expected because we're encouraging, or at least the state is encouraging, electrification of our heating systems. And if more people are putting heat pumps in their homes and driving electric vehicles, then electricity use is going to go up. But yeah, Jim.
The reason why I didn't put a dot in the affordability for consumers is two reasons. One is the echo in my head of my father saying, "God damn it, I don't own the electric company. Turn off these lights."
Yeah.
And if it's too expensive to use, then you're going to use less.
Yeah.
So there's, when your bill comes and you find yourself not being able to afford your current use, you're going to make the logical decision to not use as much.
Well, unfortunately, if somebody has electric heat, that might result in them turning it down to the point where it becomes, for an elderly person, dangerous to their health. So I mean, it's a huge trade-off. I mean, less electricity consumption isn't necessarily good in that case. And I think, what you mentioned about, is something trending up or down. I mean, take a look at something like Bennington, and when the Everett plant closed, I'm sure net electricity consumption went down significantly, which is good, but it also resulted in the loss of several hundred jobs.
Yeah.
So it's always a mixed set of factors that result in something like that, and a mixed set of factors that result in, somebody saying policy should be geared toward increasing and increasing with regard to affordability.
Yeah. I mean, right now, the way, rates aren't necessarily structured equitably right now because, there's a number of different rates that GMP has for different types of customers, like business versus residential. But, someone who's making $100,000 a year could be paying the same price per kilowatt hour as someone who's making $20,000 a year. So it's the same price, but for the person who's making $20,000 a year, it represents a much larger portion of their income than the person making $100,000. So, any other thoughts or comments on this question before we move to the next one?
Okay, so the next question is sort of building on the conversation we had about priorities and the foundation we talked about in terms of the policies that Vermont has that encourage utilities and communities and homeowners and business owners to generate renewable electricity. Is what are the factors that are, what factors are important to you about how you personally might get renewable electricity or low carbon electricity? So does it matter if it comes from your utility provider, if you've generated it yourself, if it's shared between the two parties, or any other factors that are personally important as you make these decisions.
I think if somebody's getting electricity from a utility provider, and the utility provider says X% of this is renewable, I think that's a lot less of an impact, because how do you really believe that? I mean, it's great to hear that statistic, but if you're not physically saying, okay, I have this net metering system in my own house, I don't think it has the same impact.
Can
And so,
you expand on that just a little, Dana? Do you mean psychological impact or
Yeah.
tangible impact?
I think more of a psychological impact in terms of preference.
So you as a consumer don't necessarily feel as good about that choice as if you
Right.
put solar panels on your roof.
Unless I got more data
Yeah.
from the utility that said, and it's not just 75% from utility, from renewables, but here's exactly where it's coming from.
Right.
And if you quantify, then I think it becomes more.
Right.
The more you're aware of the details of that, the more you're going to be invested in it and have a preference for it, I think.
So, thank you.
So maybe on that suggests that perhaps the utilities need to be more creative in the way they quantify the information they tell us about renewables, so the more personal impact is clearer.
A little more transparent.
Yeah. Something that, you know, the numbers that they're giving us right now aren't really touching our hearts in any way.
I guess on the other, sort of the flip side of that, does it then feel more important to emphasize programs like net metering in Vermont that encourage renewable electricity generation that like we can see with our own eyes?
It definitely has changed my relationship with electricity to live in a house with solar panels on it. And that there's this thing, I go outside and look at this number, that's how much is being generated. And I think that's sort of relevant to what you're describing there, that in some ways, in the same way that if you write down the things that you eat, you're likely to eat fewer things, or you're likely to have a slightly different diet than if you don't think about that. And by looking at that, it's just, I'm wondering how many other, and it sort of speaks to the point we just heard, how many other elements or points out there would also, knowing them, help shape my consumption, or address, having be more thoughtful about the consumption. Since Mr. Henderson's dad isn't here to tell me to turn off the lights anymore, and so it's just the kind of thing where I'd be getting a feel for where my reduction, or where focusing on renewable and low carbon energy, where does something good for Vermont, or good for Powell, where I live, where something good happen related to that? This very aggregated supply element, once we get past personal generation, it becomes, the horse is out of the barn for, it seems like, having a local value for renewable or low carbon consumption at a household level.
So just kind of building in this general direction, I've seen a lot of really successful feedback from people who are in states that have the more dynamic pricing mechanisms that are getting a lot more involved in things like sending out alerts when electricity usage is very high and encouraging conservation in those ways. And that has certainly done a lot to raise awareness of encouraging conservation in times when of peak usage, when electricity is extremely scarce and extremely expensive. And that may be a story there where the awareness is coming from knowing that you can be part of the solution, and that is kind of tangential to the renewables discussion, but ultimately the consumption and conservation side is really well reinforced by a broad public awareness and knowing when and how to conserve. and smart meters and things like that, that really make it really tangible to people and know that they can have a meaningful impact by simply changing a simple decision.
Well, we can keep talking about some of these things. I think the next question is also tied in with this.
Yeah. So, you've seen this pie chart before in our presentation, and you also have it on your handouts. So, as I said, this can essentially represents the sources of electricity, our electricity that we use here in Vermont. And seeing the makeup of these sources here, where it currently comes from, and considering some of the trade-offs we've talked about, what would you like our electricity mix to look like in the future? Like, if I was presenting this 10, 20, 30 years from now with an updated pie chart, and your ideal, based on your own beliefs and what you've heard here tonight, what would you want this mix to look like?
Could you explain what the ISO New England mix means?
Yeah, I'll do my best.
So we can decide if we want more or less.
Yeah, so maybe what might be important is that the ISO New England mix is primarily derived from fossil fuels.
Okay.
So again, this is primarily so again, this represents Vermont's electricity usage, some of it coming both from in-state and out of state. And the 10% New England mix represents the electricity that we get from the larger New England grid, which currently is primarily derived from fossil fuels. So as of right now, about 90%, 72% is renewable, 90% is carbon-free when you factor in the nuclear, which is, again, not considered renewable, but it is considered carbon-free, and about 10% is New England mix, or, for the purposes of this conversation, fossil fuel derived. So,
And Callie,
Yeah. Yeah.
Callie, can you explain why in this particular graphic hydropower is separate? Hydro-Quebec is kind of separated out from hydropower.
yeah, I don't know if I can explain it very well. It's something I'll probably have to follow up with the Department of Public Service, but my guess is...
This came from the public services?
Yeah, so this, the handouts that we have, all of the data we've received is either generated by the Public Service Department or aggregated by them from other sources. So this graphic was created by the Department of Public Service, and I can certainly follow up and ask why Hydro-Quebec is marked as separate from hydropower. I can guess, and
So I have a guess as well, but
yeah.
what's your guess?
My best guess is that, Hydro-Quebec, getting a lot of our power from Hydro-Quebec is controversial to a lot of people for a variety of reasons. And, there's certainly a contingent of folks who are, don't really believe that we should be getting our power from Hydro-Quebec, or that we shouldn't be getting so much of it from Hydro-Quebec, or that it shouldn't be considered renewable because of some other, impacts that we don't necessarily feel here in Vermont, but folks in Quebec and the nearby area of Hydro-Quebec certainly feel. I don't want to necessarily get into a whole debate about Hydro-Quebec. That's my best guess at this time as to why that's marked separately. But you raise a really good point, and I now am interested to follow up with Public Service about why it's separate. Yeah, Jim. Oh, sorry, Phil.
I'm sorry, just to add on, I think the one other aspect, and again, just conjecture, I think ties back to Dana's point and is related to Callie's. I think that this whole perception that if we're buying energy from a large renewable energy producer, how should that count towards Vermont's credit for production of renewable energy? So that's the other kind of debate component of the whole Hydro-Quebec thing. So, sorry, Kyle, I didn't mean to put John's thought. I was curious as to what the decision was, so
Yeah.
that's an excellent follow-up.
The way I read it was a combination of like Hydro-Quebec being big industrial producer of hydropower from outside of Vermont, and then the smaller piece of the pie, hydropower, that to me represents much smaller facilities that are located in Vermont.
Yeah.
And that reinforces my reaction or my answer to the question. And it's twofold. And it really came to light with me when I met Bill Scully, who redeveloped the two powered hydro dams that are on our map, and show the two, there's three in Bennington County. One is owned by the Carthusians, and then Bill redeveloped the one in North Bennington, and then the one in Pownell. I would love to see that piece of the pie get bigger by identifying those.
Which piece of the pie, the hydropower?
The hydropower.
Okay.
I'd like to see that piece get bigger by doing a complete inventory of all the dams in Vermont. And twofold, for two reasons. After this last flooding event, we were all worried about numerous dams that were going to burst because they're all old. There's not too many new dams out there anymore. So there's a lot that are currently having hydropower go wasted because they're not generating and they're a hazard to people. So, but on the flip side of that, we could identify many of these small dams that are safe, that are producing a cent of electricity. And I think of Perrin Creek and dam after dam after dam in the village of North Bennington that, once again, Bill Scully opened up my eyes on that, and we did a class with Bennington College where we looked at each one of those dams and came up with either it's worth saving or it's not saving, and if we're going to save it, this is the way to redevelop it to produce power. So my answer is make that 17% bigger by, as I said, making the existing dams viable and removing those that are not viable anymore and getting rid of a potential threat to society and the natural resources that they impact.
So like in river, like run-of-river turbines, like other technology just outside of the dam realm, particularly in our in-state, really valuable for sort of threading the needle between the environmental impacts of empowerment and the attractiveness of renewable resources that just are generating, that can be generating electricity. And there's, I think,
Small river turbines
Yeah.
should be as much on people's minds as solar panels.
Yes, fully agree. Like if there's an incentive for this 4.6 kilowatt hour solar installation, we could probably find one for 3.5 kilowatt river turbine situation. Particularly since a lot of that infrastructure sort of somewhat exists already underneath many of our older buildings, and it would be really cool to see that growing, that hydropower component growing and having a lot more, I guess, a lot more threads to it. Which would be really great.
Yeah. I mean, and important to note too that this mix currently just shows 3% derived from solar and 1% from other renewables like wind and biomass. And I don't know. I mean, what do you think of that?
I don't love biomass.
You don't love biomass?
No, and it feels a little funny to see an emissions generator in the green and like a non-carbon in the orange, and or red, whatever, I can't really tell.
It's orange.
Okay, sorry.
We'll call it orange.
It's that also, because I mean, biomass, I guess, it's not senseless, but that one doesn't exactly feel like the most, where the future lies, in incineration.
Yeah.
I think you also have to have a critical mass of stuff to incinerate. So I noticed the big block was up in Chittenden County, so I'm assuming that's the biomass plant, like around the Hairvale or something like that. And because of the concentration of humans in Chittenden County, you have more stuff to incinerate, I guess, whereas I don't think that would probably be feasible without burning a lot of gas to get stuff to the biomass plant.
Anybody else have any thoughts on what they would ideally like this mix to look like in the future? And you can determine whether that's 5 years from now or 10 years from now.
Well, I'll certainly say I'd be perfectly happy with the nuclear component taking up all of that ISO New England fossil fuel mix. Getting to fully carbon-free energy is still an important component, and while the misgivings of this are very real, I grew up in the shadow of 3 Mile Island, the importance of getting to zero carbon energy is so paramount that accepting an increase in that orange slice is certainly something that should be on the table.
I'm also wondering, if you're looking at 30 years down the road, I mean, I'm wondering if folks are thinking about nuclear fusion, post-fission. I mean, even in the last couple of years, I mean, the big joke about nuclear fusion, of course, is that so is 25 years away, and it has been for the last 50 years. But it's becoming more feasible, and there are actual commercial companies pursuing nuclear fusion, and that would essentially erase the need for any other tech if it is successfully harnessed. And I mean, but again, it's probably 25 years away.
It's such a phenomenal story. I mean, it's wonderful
Yeah.
if that worked. Oh my goodness. I mean, I'm curious about, again, I think maybe there's more, maybe also public knowledge is always valuable. Like, does Hydro-Quebec own production rights of New England-based hydro installations? Or is it all coming out of Canada somewhere? And I think I've seen Hydro-Quebec logos on stuff in like Shelburne, Mass and things like that. It's like, yeah, they have infrastructure there. And like, were we making choices about leases for 99 years or something back in the day? And you know, it's interesting in looking where the tier 1 stuff was, where it was like, okay, where does Vermont separate out from the rest of IS? From where is it state and where is it part of a collective of states? And that also is, you know, something that is like important for sort of helping to understand in the future, like how long are these compacts binding, and what, you know, were some of these choices forced upon us by being part of a regional collective, and if so, like, was that the best negotiated outcome, or are there other ones? When would there be more decision-making authority that the legislature may have as a single entity, as a state, as opposed to a regionalism state or collection of states? That's on my mind as well.
Any other thoughts about this pie chart before we move to the last question? You look like you want to.
Nope.
No, okay,
it's
okay.
totally okay. I always look like that.
Okay, yeah.
I was glad someone else mentioned fusion. I didn't want to be the guy.
Okay, so keeping in mind all of the priorities and trade-offs that we've been talking about, I think we've already started to touch on this a little bit, but what are some of the barriers to achieving our ideal outcomes? So I feel like we've introduced psychological barriers, technological barriers. What do you think are some of like the big ones that keep you up at night?
I'm so used to it always working outside of storms. I mean, just stuff like this. The reliability is important to all of us, and it's, you know, I prefer to phrase it as the service's reliability, not as my level of dependency. Like the extent to which I can't deal with not having it, and that's, I think, one of the barriers that, you know, I know that there's relative levels of importance around hospitals and the critical services, but why can't I deal with not turning on the light at 8 o'clock at night? Like how come I'm having an issue with that? And that's a huge barrier, because I think I feel I'm not the only person who likes to use electricity all the time.
Yeah, we would not, well, I guess we could do this meeting without electricity, but
Why did I put in candle power in the last year?
Yeah.
I need to invent more chandeliers.
Sam and I actually rehearsed our presentation when the power had gone out in our office a couple days ago. So we were actually rehearsing our electricity presentation with no electricity. So.
I think it's worth looking at regulatory barriers as well. Because, Jim, you probably know more about this, about the North Bennington specific dam that's on the railroad near, downtown North Bennington. The bill wanted to put a hydro plant there, but apparently the railroad was the one that gave the no to that.
That's right.
So it's kind of like, are there other regulatory barriers that Bill ran up against that would inherently, or even unintentionally rather, discourage hydropower? Because they were in place before hydropower was thought was a viable method.
Something that I'd like to sort of mention, again, I think the conversations that we have sometimes with businesses, the thought is they participate in efficiency Vermont activities, and then they get to a point where like, you did the things, you've done the things that for which there are rebates and incentives, and now you'll be sort of slowly paying back that windfall over time with, by dint of slightly higher rates that you have here. I know we have, and the point is that these are actors in energy consumption, decision-making, as evidenced by a railroad saying no, and being able to say no, and so getting a sense of who those other, where those perspectives are, I think is also really important, not just because they say no, but also because they say something, they have something to say, and that's an important part of it as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that we haven't talked about that is a likely barrier is just this whole community / individual / societal acceptance of any particular project in any particular location, and so that's somewhat regulatory because that plays out in the regulatory process often, right? Communities or individuals being opposed to a particular renewable installation of whatever ilk near them or within eyesight of them or what have you. But there's obviously barriers that are related to just acceptance of the aesthetics or the potential safety or the noise impacts of whatever the renewable source is. Or non-carbon source if you're talking about the next point, greater acceptance of nuclear.
Well, I have one thing, it's kind of goes back to, Sheila, you were saying, well, if the electricity goes out in Arlington, it goes out in Sandy, you have no autonomy there. I mean, I guess that touches on like the vulnerability of the grid and the resilience. I mean, when you become more high-tech, of course, you become more vulnerable to bad actors who, through like a cybersecurity breach, can turn things on and off, can override certain systems, can put them into overdrive to destroy them. And so, I mean, I think that's another factor that certainly should be taken into account. Is this going to increase or decrease the resilience of the grid by introducing more technology into it?
Any last thoughts on this question or any of the conversations we've had?
It is hard to think in terms of trade-offs. Yeah, especially because so much stuff is so aggregated, disaggregated. It's so hard to think of how many more trees would I be willing to not look at because there's some heat generation or something in biomass. There's probably some amount at which I wouldn't even notice, and then the plant's far away or something like that. And it's very hard to imagine this infrastructure, as Will said, in proximity to us. That's, I think, one of the other barriers to achieving these outcomes with programs and policies is the simple difficulty of even visualizing or understanding the trade-offs in a way that feels like it's informing policies and not just anecdotally distracting us from them.
No, I don't think it's distracting. I think that, yeah, a lot of the issues that we've raised and priorities that people have, if you kind of try to think about them all at the same time, are definitely in contradiction with each other at different moments. And yeah, Jim?
Just thinking about what Bill and Jonathan have just been talking about, and regulation and aesthetics and acceptability by society. I think about this a lot. Dr. John Davidson's reservoir that he built on the backside of Equinox. Hardly anybody even knows it's there, unless you have worked to find out about it. Or, but the vast majority of Bennington County residents do have no idea that there are 2 hydro facilities up there, 2 turbines. So aesthetics, we don't even know about it. But what is the chance of anybody getting a permit to do what Dr. Davidson did back in the early 50s? That was the largest project permitted by the Army Corps of Engineers ever up until that time. He literally re-engineered the back part of Equinox Mountain for optimal flow into Lake Madeline, which on an old map I have in my house is from a topo map dated 1912. It says Spruce Swamp. And that spruce swamp is now Lake Madeline. So, on one hand you think, oh, it's so great. Nobody even knows it's there yet. It's one of those points generating electricity of the 3 in Bennington County that are hydro. But there's no way that would ever be permitted to be built today. So, that's one of my problems, and I think about that a lot because I got to become quite familiar with the whole Davidson compound during the E911 mapping process. I had like a real tour of it all because we had to map all those buildings, and I became fascinated with the man. So,
Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so just some next steps. Thank you again for participating and sharing your perspectives. Again, as Callie said, this is part of a broader outreach program through the Public Service Department. As part of an earlier piece of this program, the Public Service Department did a series of webinars on the Renewable Energy Standard and net metering and tiers, a much deeper dive than what we could go into today. And so their website has the recordings of those webinars if you just can't wait to learn more about how Tier 1 and Tier 2 work. And so that was sort of the earlier part. We're working on these events this week and next week, and then there will be opportunities for public comment and review later in November after all of the planning commissions have submitted their synthesis of the outreach work that we're doing this month. And you can get added to the PSD's mailing list if you want more information on that. Also, Callie has some local programming coming up.
Yeah, if you want to come to the EV show that we're having in Pownell on September 30th, there are flyers over on the food table. If you would like to come and either bring your EV or learn about EVs. And yeah, also, feel free to email us, either one of us or both of us, with any questions or thoughts you have after the fact. If you see a friend after this and you tell them about what an awesome time you had at this meeting and they're like, oh man, how can I take part in that? Well, we're doing one next week in Wilmington on the 27th. So, or if any of you just had so much fun tonight and you want to come again, we'll actually have some raffle prizes at that one. Yeah, so anyway.
Plus you can study ahead of time. So.
Yeah, you can study all that and just be like the smartest person in the room. Yeah, so. Okay,
And then in addition to the optional demographic survey, there's also an optional feedback survey that's just a couple of questions. And we have paper copies of both out in the other room, so we can hand those out, and if you'd be willing to take 5 minutes at the end of the night to give us some feedback, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. So the other, I'll give Sam a second to queue up round 2 for Samantha. It's your first commission meeting, right?
Scott warned me about the hazing, so.
Yeah. It's been rough so far, I know.
Yeah.
So Sam was with us full-time in July, but was unable to make the July meeting, so should have given you an official welcome to your first commission meeting. So. But we're keeping her busy, as you can see. So the other statewide project, the legislature tasked the Department of Housing and Community Development, who then subsequently tasked VAPTA, or the 11 RPCs together, with taking a look at what future land use profiles might look like in Vermont. And this is really early and conceptual at this point, but the idea behind this is really kind of threefold. One, to kind of look and see if there can be land use profiles statewide which would be consistently applied through all regional plans, municipal plans, zoning bylaws, so that there was consistency in language around the state. And that could lead potentially, if adopted, to kind of 2 outcomes. One, which would kind of play into the regulatory process, perhaps incentivizing this type of work by having common designations where permits would be, if not by right, much easier to acquire in certain areas, let's say planned growth areas, which is one of the land use profiles under consideration. And then secondarily, looking at, Vermont is also evaluating all of its designation programs right now: downtown designation, village center, neighborhood development area, growth center, and the like. New town center is the 5th. So there are 5 designation programs. The state's really taking a hard look at, are those the right programs now? Are the benefits a match for state policy? And this work will play into that work, which is simultaneously happening at the state level. So we wanted to just give an update on the concept. Samantha's prepared just a brief kind of overview of that process.
Mm-hmm.
Sam?
Yeah, so just to add to what Bill just mentioned in the introduction, we started this process over the summer, and it started with an analysis, sort of a spatial analysis of the future land use areas that Bennington County Regional Commission has already been using in our current iteration of the regional plan. And then we send that information into the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission, which has been organizing this work for VAPTA. And they came back with sort of a proposed set of shared future land use profiles. And then Bill and the other RPC directors had a conversation about it last week, and there's been another iteration already. So it's definitely still in our rough draft form. And then, some of the objectives for the process that Bill just mentioned. So this is what our current future land use designations look like. It's very cumbersome to talk about. But this is a map from the regional energy plan, actually, but it reflects the future land use designations that are in the current iteration of the regional plan. And so we have 5 land use profiles in Bennington County in our regional plan. So there's the urban designation, which only really applies to areas in Bennington and Manchester. Villages, which generally map onto where there are village designations, although not 100% anymore. There are hamlets, and then a lot of the county area is rural, and most of it is under this forest designation, which has the most stringent regulations and the least development. So as part of the spatial analysis that we did for the first stage of the project, we looked at the sort of description in the regional plan, as well as what the intent and the type of development in each land use and area are. And then I did some spatial analysis to look at the residential density in those different areas, whether they're served by planned water, wastewater, stormwater, and three-phase electricity, and then whether they have sidewalks in the area, transit service, and then how much they overlap with known and possible state and local constraints. And all of this was passed back to CCRPC, and they sort of gathered all of that analysis from all of the RPCs to try to come up with some sort of shared vocabulary, shared future land use areas. So here are sort of the three tiers of how this has been progressing. So the top row is what we currently have in place right now. The middle row is the first draft that VAPTA came back with and that the RPC executive directors discussed last week. And then just yesterday, they had synthesized that discussion and they've proposed another iteration. So kind of the latest iteration on the very bottom includes, well, all of them include sort of three main buckets: the growth areas, the rural and conservation areas, and then some optional special use areas. And so in the growth areas, we're now talking about having most of the focus be around planned growth areas, and then also including some village centers that I think ideally would line up with the designations. And then this transitional area that's sort of planned but not necessarily including the density quite yet. Then the primary focus for the rural and conservation areas would be on just one rural land use type, with the option to include sort of sub areas that are working lands or conserved or protected lands. And then in the special use areas, there's interest in a resource-based recreation area, this enterprise area, and then keeping hamlets.
Can't be anti-Hamlet.
No. And so this is a very early draft map of what this might look like. And also this, I made this before the latest iteration came out, so it doesn't reflect the most up-to-date information, but just to give you a sense of kind of what it might look like. The urban centers would pretty much become regional centers and still mostly be focused on Bennington and Manchester. The village centers would, again, ideally better reflect what the village designations already are, so those would be synonymous. Resort area, we've been talking about, we don't currently have that in our future land use designations, but there could be resort areas in Manchester, Peru, Dorset.
And that, at the VAPTA retreat where this was discussed last week, you'll see that whole discussion around resorts. There was large agreement that it shouldn't just be the focus on existing resorts, but rather places where resource-based recreation could occur. So it actually could be a broader category within the Bennington region if we look at it that way, and that's why on this third iteration that Sam shared that came out yesterday, resorts gone, resource-based recreation is in.
Yeah, so yeah, this is old news. And then yeah, in this iteration also there was interest in breaking up the sort of rural area into three separate sections, and so again this might not be the direction things are moving, but this sort of gives a sense of the blue being where there are state identified known constraints, so very like very stringent regulations around development. And then rural being sort of more general, low density, not served by utilities as with great frequency. And then in terms of the transitional and the enterprise zones, those really don't exist right now in our current plan, and so we would have to do more intentional work to understand where exactly those would be mapped in our area.
Is it clear what they are?
Yeah, I think so. I brought the descriptions. So transitional is kind of like commercial and sort of mixed use areas right now that are adjacent to the more urban areas. With this description, there's like a desire or a plan to develop them into more mixed use, higher density development. And then the enterprise, I think, is a bit more like industrial development right now. Yeah, but they're not necessarily adjacent to planned growth areas. And just in terms of next steps, the idea is to be sort of sharing this as a very early draft stage with all of you and getting any feedback. And there are still revisions happening to the working document. And there is yet to be a discussion about how the maps actually would be utilized. And there's a report due later this year, so there's still time to gather input.
So this is still very conceptual. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah.
That was an excellent overview, and Sam definitely was thrown a kind of curveball with the report. They came out literally at 7 o'clock last night with the kind of next iteration. So thanks for incorporating the things that you did already. Report to the legislature in December, so very conceptual. In terms of how the maps are used, I mean, there is this kind of, I don't know how much of a reach it is, but this potential desire that when communities map these areas that meet these definitions, perhaps those, let's say, planned growth area would serve in place of a downtown designation, or the village areas would serve in place of the village center designation. So there wouldn't be a separate process. It would almost be, once the community decides this is where the growth should happen, that the benefits that the state offers would accrue to that particular region.
I have a really limited understanding of the designations.
Okay.
Really only in the sense of a village center designation, but that has always been spoken as a non-regulatory designation. But it sounds like designations are now moving into the regulatory realm. Is that really happening? Or does it already exist?
So they're non-regulatory to the extent that they don't present additional regulations or hurdles to development. In fact, they're intended to lower the barriers to. Okay. But I think the challenge right now is, given the demand, particularly for housing, there's pretty broad acceptance that those regulatory benefits are not robust enough. So, is this an opportunity through this designation process and through what we believe are upcoming reforms to Act 250 to really kind of tie those things together and make all of the designation process, the land use mapping process, the regulatory process, all consistent with state policy to generate, in this particular case, more housing, or whatever the state policy happens to be.
It just seems
there's
that there's a lot of history with designations having already been established.
Yeah.
And when the nature of the designation and what it is and what it changes, and you've already got one, what happens to you?
Right. Yeah. I mean that's
You know.
It's going to be interesting. The state, they've hired 2 outside consultants. There's been a series of public meetings. We participated in a number of them. There have been some survey work. So there's this whole designation 2050 effort to see what those programs are going to look like. My gut tells me there are going to be fewer programs than the 5 that currently exist. My gut tells me that the benefits will be more robust and more tangible and more easily understood. But how we get from this concept of this is what we want through that process, including what do you do with the existing ones? Yeah, it remains to be seen.
And what's driving, I'm pretty familiar with the production of legislative studies and what they're actually being done for.
Yeah.
Is this, I've seen them driven by agencies that want to take action, that get the legislature to have a study so they can have an action, or I've seen studies driven by the legislature who aren't sure what they want to do, so they step back and say, let's have a do you have a sense of where that's coming from?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And it's
a
way,
really great question.
way down in the weeds that
Yeah.
nobody really needs to
So
go to.
I think the designation study is being driven by the RPCs and the Department of Housing and Community Development.
Okay.
We're speaking on behalf of their municipalities,
Yeah.
saying, you know what, these programs just really aren't working and aren't aligning with state policy. There are 2. There's another study that BAP is involved with regard to Act 250 and potential changes there. There's a similar Act 250 study that is being conducted by the Vermont Natural Resources Council. Both of those reports are due in December. Those are direct asks from the legislature because they want to understand what are the opportunities to change there. This, I think, is being driven through the work of the Department of Housing and Community Development, convincing the legislature that there is benefit in more consistent language around the state so that we're all kind of speaking the same thing in the planning and zoning realm. So that's my take on where the studies that we're involved in are going.
Mine.
Curious, is when it says that special use areas and sub-areas for rural conservation are optional,
Yeah,
whose option is it?
the regions.
Okay.
So we, as a region, when we're updating our regional plan, would decide, you know what, we're going to have these subcategories or not. Based on the discussion last week, I would not be surprised if enterprise also ends up, and potentially transitional as that optional category. Yeah, and I think there is now wide agreement that Hamlet, in terms of mapping, is going to be a dot and not a polygon. So,
And at what point?
matters to people that see them.
At what point do the voices of the municipalities who have to update their land use maps come into this process?
Yeah, well, and those are going to be loud.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this drumbeat right in the back of all of our heads about local control. Well, right? I mean, this is
It's an exciting thing precisely because it's exactly like that, I would say. And this is something that ultimately is something that the uniformity across the state is going to make it a lot easier for all of us town to speak to each other.
Yeah.
And when we're trying to comment on each other's changes, it's going to make for a lot easier opportunity for us to feel like we're being engaged in meaningful conversation with our peers about coordinating local growth across municipalities. It's always really hard when you're talking about what does mixed use mean in each different town.
Yeah.
But I think it really excites me as a project that we can that the state's taking action to try and bring some same language to all of our conversations.
Thanks. And yeah, that's exactly the input that I think that the state's looking for. So that's helpful, along with along with Sheila, this is gonna be a discussion, and there's gonna be pushback, no question, whatever comes out of the report, which will, you know, again, just feed into the legislative process, so we all know what can happen in that process, so. Stay tuned, but we wanted the commissioners to be aware that this is underway, and Sam in particular in our office has done a lot of really hard work on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Is there any other business from our small but hearty group this evening? So we really appreciate the input. I think even with a small group, this has been really beneficial to the type of input that we need to kind of feed up the chain. So thank you for coming out this evening.
Oh, and Sam's bringing the surveys. If you want to take just
yes.
a couple minutes,
Please
the
do.
feedback and Denver, they're short surveys.
Sure.
Thank you, yeah.
Great. Thanks, everybody.